Rain pressed against the windows of the small-town diner that night. At the window table, a man in his late 40s sat with his retired black German shepherd and a folded camouflage jacket on the seat beside them. Tomorrow he meant to hand the fire chief an envelope ending their nights on call. When the dog set one paw on that jacket and refused to move, his hand tightened on the envelope and he felt walking away might be wrong. He knew the hour without looking at the clock. Late light from the small kitchen window laid a thin bar across the table, turning the old formica into pale gold. The heater knocked once, then went still. The whole little rental felt like it was holding its breath, waiting for something that never quite happened anymore. He rubbed the knot in his shoulder and told himself it was just another quiet evening. From the hallway came a soft, familiar creak, the same board near the back door that spoke up every night. It sounded like weight shifting, pausing, then shifting again. He glanced over, hand tightening around his coffee mug. Nothing there, just the dark line of the closed door and the faint outline of a hanging strap on the hook. The air along his neck prickled as if someone had just walked past. On the chair by the window sat the folded camouflage jacket, cuffs tucked in neat, like someone meant to come back for it. The pattern caught the last of the sun, a scatter of dull greens and browns against worn wood. He avoided looking at it too long. The way you avoid looking at a framed photograph you're not ready to dust. Still, he felt pulled to it, as if it might shift on its own. A faint click touched the silence, something brushing the metal threshold at the back. Then a slow exhale, the kind that almost blends into the hum of the refrigerator if you're not listening for it. His forearm tightened with goosebumps. He told himself it was just the house settling, or pipes, or the ancient heater wheezing. His heartbeat didn't believe that, but he kept the thought anyway. He crossed the small living room, floor cool under his socks, and stopped where the carpet dipped beside the door. That same shallow depression was there every night at this time, as though someone stood in that spot at attention, waiting. He shifted his weight into it and felt the odd fit, like standing in another person's shoes. A shiver crawled up through his ribs and he stepped away. Outside, a siren moaned far off on the highway, fading quickly, just a thin thread over the rooftops. He felt his chest tighten the way it always did at that sound, thumb rubbing the old callus along his palm. The strap on the hook swayed once, barely, as if brushed by something invisible. He blinked hard and blamed the draft that squeezed under the doorframe in winter. Later, under the thin quilt in the back bedroom, he felt the mattress dip near his legs, the faintest pull as if a weight had leaned there. Warmth gathered against his shin, then slipped away. He lay still, staring at the crack in the ceiling, listening to slow breaths that might have been his own. It had been years He reminded himself. Habit's echo. That was all. But as the red digits on the clock rolled past the same minute they always did, the creak near the door, the soft click on the threshold, the way the air seemed to wait with him, all came again in their quiet order. Something in this little house still kept time with an old routine, still expecting a call, a command, a movement toward the night, and he was the only one left awake to feel it. Morning came with a thin frost on the truck windshield and a grey band of cloud over the low hills. He shrugged into a flannel shirt, lifted the folded camouflage jacket from the chair, and hesitated. It still felt heavy for its size. Finally, he carried it out, locking the door behind him. The big black shepherd waiting on the stoop fell into step without being asked, nails ticking softly on the concrete as they headed toward town. The small-town diner sat on the corner like it always had, windows fogged at the bottom, neon coffee cup flickering in the dim. When he pushed the door open, the bell chimed and the shepherd's ears tipped forward, taking in grease, bacon, and the murmur of early voices. They walked straight to the window side booth table, the one that looked out on Main Street. The animal slid under the table, but not before glancing toward the empty booth seat. Morning. Mark. Shadow still on patrol. Ruby called from behind the counter, wiping a mug. Mark managed a half smile as he laid the folded camouflage jacket on the window side booth seat. Old habits, he said. Shadow's nails scraped once on the linoleum, then went quiet. Mark wrapped his hands around a chipped white cup, letting the heat sink in while he watched traffic roll past the glass. By late afternoon, back at the house, the pattern repeated. At the exact same slice of evening, Shadow rose from his spot near the couch and moved the hallway, pacing a slow line between front window and back door. Nails on wood. Pause. Turn. Repeat. Mark listened from his chair, telling himself it was just old bones needing to move, muscle memory from years on duty. The sounds threaded straight through his chest anyway. On a hook by the door hung the empty harness and the long leather leash, coiled tight. Shadow stopped beneath them, lifted his nose to the folded camouflage jacket Mark had draped there earlier, and breathed deep. The big head nudged the fabric once, twice, then looked back at him with a low whiff. Mark shook his head, voice rough as he muttered, "Not tonight, buddy. Those days are done." The next morning they returned to the diner. Mark slid into the window side booth, set the folded camouflage jacket carefully on the window side booth seat again, and reached down to touch the thick fur between Shadow's ears. Instead of settling under the table, the shepherd put both front paws up, resting them near the jacket, gaze fixed on the road outside. Sunlight spilled in, catching the faint grey along the dog's muzzle. Ruby paused as she set down their usual plate. "He always looks like he's waiting for somebody," she said softly. Mark shrugged, but a knot formed behind his breastbone. Maybe he just likes the view. Shadow's paw slid slightly, claws whispering against vinyl as it came to rest close to the folded camouflage jacket on the window side booth seat. Unmistakably deliberate. As the day wore on and they came and went, Mark couldn't unsee it. The way Shadow lingered by that exact booth, the way he circled the table once before lying down, the way his eyes cut from jacket to road and back, as if checking attendance. Walking home in the cool evening, Mark found himself asking a question he'd dodged for years. Why that table? Why that jacket? And why could this old partner never quite settle unless the folded camouflage jacket sat on the window side booth seat? The first time he saw Shadow, the dog was all angles and focus in a muddy training field at the edge of the state fairgrounds. Mark had still worn a newer version of the same pattern, the camouflage uniform jacket tight across his shoulders, name, tape, sharp and unfrayed. A trainer tossed a glove into high grass, snapped a command, and the black shepherd surged forward like a released spring, nose low, tail level. Mark felt something in him lean toward that purpose. Back then, nights belonged to radios and sirens. The state's search and rescue unit bounced between floods, lost hikers, overturned trucks on back roads. Shadow rode in the crate behind him, quiet until the back hatch popped. In driving rain, in snow that squeaked under boots, in fields that smelled of diesel and wet earth, the dog ranged out and back, checking with a quick glance before plunging on. Mark learned to sleep in 10-minute pieces. Boots on, jacket always near. His younger brother Luke had laughed at the way Shadow ignored everyone but Mark. Luke was guard, same pattern on his back, but his work kept him on the big base 2 hours away. When their schedules lined up, they met at the small town diner, always the same window side booth table. Luke liked the corner closest to the glass, where he could watch people come and go. He'd shrug off his camouflage jacket, fold it neat on the window side booth seat beside him, and talk with his hands. Shadow remembered. The dog lay under the table in those days too, head occasionally resting on Luke's boot. When the bell over the diner door chimed, Shadow's ears flicked, but his eyes went back to Luke's folded camouflage jacket on the window side booth seat, as if that square of fabric mattered more than the parade of strangers. Luke teased that Head found himself another fan. Mark just felt the quiet comfort of his brother's easy grin. The bad spring came 3 years later, the one where the river forgot its banks. Rain stacked over the hills, filling ravines, carving at old bridges. The guard convoy rolled out from the base before dawn, Luke among them, while Mark waited by a high-water rescue truck with Shadow. Assignments still unclear. Their last conversation was over the phone. Less than a minute. Luke joked about diner pie when it was over. Mark promised coffee on him. By afternoon, radio traffic turned jagged. A levee section failed near an old industrial lot downstream. Guard trucks scrambled. Evacuations rushed. Somewhere in the chaos, Luke's vehicle went off a washed-out edge. The words came broken through, static vehicle overturned, then the codes that meant they were too late. Mark stood in brown water up to his shins, Shadow whining softly at his side, holding on to the roof of a trapped sedan while they cut out a family. There was no time to drive to the other scene. In the weeks that followed, the folded camouflage jacket was all that came home. An officer handed it to their mother at the small ceremony, but she pressed it into Mark's arms afterward. "You two had the booth," she said, voice thin. "You keep it." The fabric still smelled faintly of aftershave and diner grease. Mark brought it back to his empty house and couldn't decide where it belonged, so he kept moving it from chair to chair. Shadow searched every room that first month, nose catching on the jacket each time. The dog circled the kitchen table, trotted to the front door, then to the window where Mark could see the distant glow of the diner's neon cup sign. More than once, Shadow nudged the jacket off its resting place, dragging it toward the door with his teeth while Mark snapped, too sharply, for him to leave it. The animal would sit then, staring, as if waiting for someone Mark could no longer bring home. Eventually, the calls slowed. Younger teams took more of the missions. New dogs filled the training field. Mark's body grew tired of wet nights and cold radios. He signed the retirement papers with a dull pen. Shadow's harness folded on the table beside the stack. He told himself they'd both earned quiet. Yet every time a siren wailed faintly in the distance, Shadow's head would lift, eyes tracking some path only he could see. Mark pretended not to notice, because noticing hurt. The diner became their compromise. No more staging trucks in its parking lot. No more mission briefings scribbled on napkins. But the window side booth table was still there. When Mark finally carried the folded camouflage jacket out in public again and laid it on the window side booth seat, Shadow pressed close, shoulders tight. The dog inhaled as if head found a thin, wandering thread of Luke woven into the grease and sunlight. Mark, heart thick, realized why letting go felt impossible. To release the jacket felt like releasing his brother, and maybe a piece of the work that had once given his own days shape. It started with the harness. One grey morning, while Mark washed dishes in the sink, he heard a soft clatter behind him. He turned to find Shadow standing under the hook by the door. the worn leather harness gripped gently in his teeth. The dog held it without tugging, eyes steady, as if presenting an argument instead of a toy. A thin line of water ran from Mark's elbow to the floor while he stared. "Where do you think we're going?" he asked, voice catching more than he liked. Shadow stepped forward, bridge of his nose pressing the harness into Mark's thigh. Behind the dog, the folded camouflage jacket rested on the chair, catching a dull patch of light. The scene felt like a memory he hadn't lived, yet door open. Jacket on shoulders, radio crackling. Mark swallowed and shook his head, hanging the harness back up with hands that weren't quite steady. The phone rang that afternoon. Number from the volunteer fire department blinking on the screen. He let it buzz itself quiet. Second call came an hour later. They were short-staffed, the chief said in his voicemail. Lots of older guys stepping back, wondering if Mark might want to sit in on a meeting, maybe bring Shadow for a demonstration. Mark deleted the message, telling himself they needed younger legs now. Behind him, nails clicked once across the floor, then stopped. At the diner that evening, Ruby slid into the booth opposite him during a lull, topping off his coffee without asking. Chief was in earlier, she said. Eyes kind. Said he'd love to see Shadow up at the station again. Folks still talk about that winter search you two pulled off. Mark stared at the folded camouflage jacket on the window side booth seat, fingers tracing the faded name tape. "We're out of that game," he murmured. "Let the fresh crews run." Shadow rose from under the table, surprising him. The dog placed one heavy paw on the edge of the window side booth seat, claws whispering near the folded camouflage jacket. Then the shepherd's head angled toward the glass, eyes following a passing ambulance as its lights washed muted red across the diner walls. Mark felt the colour skim his own face, raising old ghosts. When the siren faded, Shadow's gaze returned to him, questioning and intent. Days layered quietly, but the signals kept coming. A windstorm rattled the siding one night, and a transformer blew on the far street, plunging the block into darkness. As Mark fumbled for a flashlight, he heard Shadow move straight to the door, posture alert. The dog's tail brushed the folded camouflage jacket where it hung, sending a small shiver through the fabric. Mark's heartbeat jumped in his throat. The dark, suddenly full of possibility, had sworn he no longer wanted. On a chilly Saturday morning, he finally opened the back of the hall closet to thin out forgotten coats. The harness lay there too, under an old blanket. Shadow's nose appeared around his arm. Then the dog shouldered in, teeth closing around the leather with firm care. He backed out, turned, and carried it toward the front door, dropping it with a small thud on the mat. Mark's chest tightened as if someone had placed a hand there and pushed. "Buddy, I don't know that we've got another run in us," he whispered, kneeling to rub behind Shadow's ears. The dog leaned into the touch, but his eyes drifted past Mark to the street visible through the front window, then to the distant flicker of the diner's sign. It was as if every part of Shadow's world still connected door, harness, jacket, and that window-side booth table in one unbroken loop. That night, while the town settled under a low ceiling of cloud, Mark lay awake and listened. The familiar sequence came floorboard creak, soft step, faint breath near the bedroom doorway. But something in it felt less like restless pacing and more like a gentle knock on a door inside his own chest. By the time the clock showed the same old minute, he realized the unease wasn't about noise at all. It was about what would happen if he kept ignoring a partner who was clearly still on duty. The rain started as a mist, blurring the line of hills beyond town late on a Tuesday. By evening, it came in sheets, drumming on the diner's broad front windows hard enough to drown out the clatter of dishes. Mark sat at the window-side booth table, sleeves rolled, watching taillights smear into red streaks on Main Street. The folded camouflage jacket rested on the window-side booth seat beside him, a small island of order in the watery light. Shadow lay under the table at first, chin on paws, eyes not quite closed. Each time a siren wailed in the distance, the dog's head lifted, ears pricking toward the sound. Ruby turned up the radio behind the counter, weather announcer listing flood advisories for low-lying farms along the creek. Springs showing her teeth early, she muttered as she passed. Mark nodded, but his fingers had already found the frayed edge of the jacket's cuff, rolling it back and forth. The first call came to his phone just after dark. Volunteer chief again. A truck from town hadn't returned from a supply run to the outlying trailer park. Driver was Walt, a retired mechanic who ate at the diner 3 times a week and always tipped Shadow a sausage. Water was creeping over the low bridge in that direction. They were organizing a search before it rose higher. "Could use your eyes," the chief said. "And that nose of his, if he's willing." Mark stared at the swirling rain beyond the glass while the words buzzed in his ear. He looked down at Shadow, at the grey now webbing through the dog's black coat, at the stiffness when he rose from a nap. One more night slogging through ditches and brush in weather like this could go wrong fast. Images flashed up uninvited Luke's convoy in the storm years ago. The call that never finished. The folded camouflage jacket handed to their mother. His throat closed. "I'm not sure he's up for it," he said finally. After he hung up, the quiet inside the diner seemed to thicken. Shadow pushed out from under the table and stood, body lined up perfectly with the window-side booth seat. He set one paw beside the folded camouflage jacket on the window-side booth seat, then another, as if anchoring himself. His gaze didn't leave Mark's face. Outside, lightning stitched pale lines behind the clouds, the flicker reflecting in the dog's eyes. Mark felt the old familiar thud of adrenaline wake up in his veins. Ruby approached slowly, drying her hands on a towel. "That Walt's truck they're looking for?" she asked, voice low. When Mark nodded, she sighed, glancing toward the storm. "You know he wouldn't think twice about wading out there for you." Or Shadow. Man's stubborn as they come. She looked down at the dog's steady stance, at the way he guarded the jacket like a flag. Looks like somebody's already decided his vote. The chief called again, this time from the firehouse. Engine noise and voices in the background. Water was rising faster than forecast. Sheriff's deputies were slammed with other calls. If Walt had tried to push through the low area by the cottonwoods, he might be stuck in a ditch or worse. "We're setting up a staging point at Ruby's," the chief said. "Parking's high there. You coming or not?" Mark. The question hung wider than just the night's job. Rain chased them to the door as Mark ended the call. He stood slowly, knees protesting. Shadow didn't move. The dog's weight remained rooted beside the folded camouflage jacket on the window side booth seat. Muscles taut, eyes bright. Mark reached for the jacket, then let his hand fall. Fear, thick and familiar, squeezed behind his ribs, the fear of dragging an aging partner into danger, of failing someone again the way Head failed his brother by being miles away. Engines rumbled into the lot. Lights, strobes of red and white across the diner walls as volunteers filed in. Rain slickers, shining. The door banged open and the chief stepped inside. Dripping. "Road's barely passable now," he said, scanning the room. "We've got a narrow window before the creek takes that shoulder entirely." His gaze landed on Shadow and the jacket. "You two were bred for this kind of mess." Mark looked around the familiar space, the checkered tablecloths, the photograph of the town's old baseball team, the crooked clock above the coffee pots. It felt like the whole place was watching, even the empty stalls. Shadow's tail gave one slow sweep, then stilled. The dog's paw pressed closer to the folded camouflage jacket on the window side booth seat, claws dimpling the fabric. Mark realized Head reached the line Head been circling for years. He could no longer pretend the choice wasn't his. For a long moment, Mark didn't move. Rain rattled on the glass. Volunteers talked in low, urgent voices near the counter, and the smell of coffee mixed with wet wool. Shadow held his ground beside the window side booth seat, paw firm on the vinyl near the folded camouflage jacket. The dog's eyes never left Mark's, as if every search they'd ever run had come down to this silent standoff in a small-town diner. He reached for the jacket again. Slower this time. Shadow's gaze flicked to the motion, then back up, body tensing not in resistance, but in readiness. Mark's fingers touched the fabric, rough from years of wear, and a wave of scent rose grease. Old canvas, the faint ghost of Luke's cologne. In the reflection on the window, he caught a dozen versions of himself layered together. Younger, in uniform. Older, in flannel. Somewhere in between, still carrying the same weight. Is that his? The chief asked quietly, nodding toward the jacket. Mark swallowed and nodded. Luke's, he said. The name felt like it hadn't been said aloud in that room for a long time, though the diner had once echoed with it. Ruby's eyes softened, memories rising behind them. Shadow's nose dipped, breathing deep against the fold, as though acknowledging both the man they'd lost and the work still in front of them. In a flash, understanding clicked into place. The years of Shadow pacing at sirens, the insistent nudging of the harness, the way he refused to settle unless the folded camouflage jacket sat on the window-side booth seat. It hadn't just been grief. Shadow wasn't asking to go back to the past. Had been holding open a door, insisting that Luke's memory belonged out in the living, where it could still pull someone else through a bad night. With hands that trembled only a little, Mark lifted the jacket from the seat. The fabric was heavier than he remembered, or maybe had just grown used to carrying its weight on the inside. As he slid his arms into the sleeves, the room around him shifted focus. The chatter dimmed. The rain's drumming sharpened. Shadow sat back on his haunches, then rose smoothly, shoulders aligning under the old harness Mark hadn't realized had dropped onto the booth. Ruby stepped forward and tugged the zipper up to his chest, just like she had on 100 cold mornings years ago. There, she murmured. That looks right. Her fingers lingered for a second over Luke's faded name tape, then moved away. The chief clapped Mark on the shoulder. Grip firm. Well, take it easy on the old man, he said with a wry half smile. And well, be smart about the water. But I've seen what you two can do when someone needs finding. They stepped out into the storm, wind shoving hard at the door as if trying to push them back. Floodlights from the parked trucks threw long shadows across the puddled lot. Shadow moved with cautious power, nose already testing the air. Mark felt the old rhythm slide into place, check radio. Glance at map, meet the eyes of the crew. But this time, with Luke's jacket on his back, it no longer felt like trying to relive something. It felt like carrying someone forward. At the edge of town, near the dip where the road met the low cottonwood stand, debris clogged the culverts. Water spilled over, turning the shoulder into a shallow river. Searchers fanned out in pairs, sweeping ditches and fence lines with flashlights. Mark opened the truck's passenger door and grabbed an oily rag Walt always used on his hands, holding it out for Shadow to scent. The dog inhaled, then glanced briefly back toward the direction of the diner, as if marking the connection before pulling into his harness. They moved through rain and mud, Shadow zigzagging ahead, checking currents of scent along the flooded roadside. Twice he paused, looking back at Mark with a low whine, testing his handler's resolve. Each time, Mark nodded, the old hand gesture falling naturally. "Show me," he murmured. The dog surged forward again. Behind them, the lights of town blurred into a hazy glow, anchored in Mark's mind by that window-side booth table where the decision had been made. Near a bend where the pavement crumbled into gravel, Shadow stopped hard, head thrown high. A second later, he veered down into the ditch, muscles bunching as mud sucked at his paws. Mark slid after him, boots filling with cold water. The beam of his flashlight caught twisted metal and the pale curve of a truck fender pressed against a tangle of brush. Walt's truck, nose down, trapped but not yet swallowed by the rising flow. "Walt, it's Mark," he shouted over the roar of water. A faint answering cough came from the cab, followed by a hoarse, disbelieving laugh. "Thought I was done for," Walt rasped as they worked, with help from the others, to brace the truck and pry open the door. Shadow stayed pressed against the man's leg when they finally helped him up to the road, refusing to move away until Walt's feet were steady on the gravel. Only then did the dog shake off, sending a spray of droplets into the wet night. Later, as they loaded Walt into an ambulance, the chief pulled Mark aside. "We're putting your names back on the call sheet," he said simply. "Doesn't have to be every run. But tonight made it clear you're not as retired as you thought." Shadow leaned against Mark's hip, warm and solid, Luke's jacket damp but snug around his shoulders. For the first time since the flood years ago, Mark felt the knot in his chest loosen into something like relief. The work hadn't ended with loss. It had waited for him to be ready again. The storm left branches scattered and puddles shining like dark glass across Main Street. In the weeks that followed, life in town returned to its slow rhythm. But something in Mark's days had shifted. The folded camouflage jacket no longer lived on a lonely chair at home. Most mornings, he shrugged into it before clipping Shadow's harness, accepting the small tug of memory as part of the outfit rather than an anchor dragging him backward. They walked a new route now, looping past the firehouse before heading to the diner. Shadow trotted a little ahead, still pausing to sniff every driveway like a careful inspector. Younger volunteers nodded when Mark stepped into the bay, some with the respectful curiosity of people who'd grown up hearing stories about his and Shadow's earlier years. He'd demonstrate a search pattern now and then, watching their faces light as the dog found a hidden glove or wallet. At the diner, the window side booth table remained theirs. Ruby had stopped asking if they wanted a different spot. Shadow settled under the table more often than he used to, resting his head on Mark's boot. On days when a distant siren floated through town, the dog would rise, place a paw near the folded camouflage jacket on the window side booth seat, and look up. Sometimes the call was nothing urgent. Sometimes Mark's phone would buzz, and he'd press a hand to the dog's shoulder, letting him know they were going. Small assignments came. A missing fisherman who'd gotten turned around in the fog by the reservoir. An elderly woman who'd wandered from her son's farmhouse at dusk. A teenager stuck in a gully after taking a dirt bike down the wrong trail. They were careful about Shadow's limits, choosing work that fit his years. Each time, the dog moved with quiet purpose. And each time, Mark felt that familiar steadiness rise in him, like a well he'd thought had run dry. Around town, the way people saw them shifted too. Walt, patched up and full of stories, made a habit of dropping off spare parts at Mark's small shop with a wink and a pat for Shadow. Parents pointed out the black shepherd to their kids from a safe distance, explaining that he was one of the helpers. Ruby kept a photograph near the register of Mark, Shadow, and Walt on the night the truck was pulled up, all three of them drenched and grinning in disbelief. Seasons turned. Summer heat gave way to the crisp slide of autumn, leaves skittering along the sidewalk outside the diner. On particularly cold mornings, when Mark's knees protested, Shadow would slow his pace unasked, matching his handler step for step. Inside the warm clatter of the diner, the jacket would rest on the window side booth seat, less like an unspoken question now and more like part of the town's quiet story. One evening, as the sun dropped behind the grain elevators and turned the windows to sheets of brass, Mark leaned back in the booth and watched Shadow sleep at his feet. He realized there was a rhythm to his days. Again, walk, coffee, occasional calls, shared silences. The ache of Luke's absence remained, but it had softened, woven into new memories, instead of standing alone like a jagged rock in an empty field. The dog had not only led him back into the world, he had taught him how to move through it differently. Years later, the diner looked much the same, though the neon coffee cup had finally been replaced and the checkered tablecloths were new. The window side booth table still caught the best light in late afternoon. Mark slid into his usual spot, easing joints that had earned their stiffness honestly. The folded camouflage jacket lay on the window side booth seat beside him, fabric thinned and soft from countless wears and careful washes. Shadow was slower now, muzzle almost entirely silver, but his eyes remained clear. He lowered himself onto the cool floor with practiced care, sighing once before, resting his head against Mark's boot. Outside, Main Street moved at its unhurried-paced delivery truck at the feed store. Kids on bikes, weaving around puddles. A postal jeep bumping over a pothole that never quite stayed patched. Inside, the hum of conversation wrapped around them like familiar music. A young man bussing tables paused by the booth, eyes lingering on the jacket. "Sir, if you don't mind me asking," he said, shy but curious. "Whose is that? I've seen you with it since I started last year." Mark looked down at the folded camouflage jacket on the window side booth seat, then at Shadow, who had opened one eye at the sound of the question. "It was my brother's," Mark said, voice steady. "And it rode on a lot of calls with us after he was gone. Helped bring a few folks home." He patted the jacket once, then reached down to scratch behind Shadow's ears. "Some things you keep on the shelf. Some things you keep in motion." This turned out to be one of the moving kind. The young man nodded slowly, as if tucking the thought away for later. When the plates were cleared and the last of the coffee sipped, Mark rose carefully. Shadow pushed himself up too, leaning briefly against Mark's leg until balance settled. Together they stepped out into the fading light, the bell over the door chiming a note that had accompanied most of their shared years. Mark slipped the jacket over his shoulders, not because he needed its warmth, but because it felt right, like carrying a quiet promise down the sidewalk. They walked home at an easy pace, breeze ruffling the dog's fur, sky streaked with the soft colours that come just before evening truly falls. Cars whispered past, and somewhere in the distance a siren sounded, then faded. Shadow's ears flicked, but he did not rise in alarm. He simply glanced up at Mark, then continued on, side by side. Man, dog, and the memory stitched into that worn camouflage blended into the small town streets they'd helped keep whole. The house at the end of their route no longer felt like a place waiting for something that would never come. It felt simply like home. If this story touched your heart, drop a simple 1 in the comments to let us know you were here. Your support keeps these gentle stories alive. Don't forget to subscribe and stay with us, because the next story might just be the one that finds you when you least expect it.